So we're gonna end up rotating the agenda around just a little bit here. Weather delayed some of the, hi Patrick, delayed some of the Gunnison Energy folks. And David Baumgarten from the county, Gunnison County is going to be calling in a few minutes, as you heard. So we'll just flex our agenda around a little bit to make sure we get to everything. So the first thing I want to do is talk about ground rules. I have an updated copy of the ground rules for you right here. Send those around. So take a quick look at these. Everything is the same except that I added in that will be allowing community input at the end of each meeting. And so I've added that in to the ground rules under item number 8 on the ground rules participant side that reads, the public is allowed at all meetings to further transparency. The public will be invited to offer their input at the end of each meeting. And then a corresponding ground rule under ground rules for public observers, which I updated number 5, that no debate with the working group will be allowed. However, the public will be invited to provide their input at the end of each meeting. Comments will be limited to 3 minutes each so that we don't end up having extra late meetings on that. The intent of that no debate is to just not sit here with philosophical back and forths, but to kind of try to keep us issue focused and task oriented on that. And then left in, as we discussed at our last meeting, that if anyone from the public has got specific information that they want to present to us beyond just that kind of chiming in at the end, they're welcome to work with me ahead of the agenda and get on the agenda to provide that input or conversation with you as an agenda item specifically. Any comments on these? It should, otherwise everything's the same as what we've had in the past. Alright. If you see something, holler at me. The next item that we'll just get this business stuff out of the way while we wait for everybody. So we discussed that at our last meeting that we would really kind of zero in and I put together an outline for you of our purpose and process. So I've taken a stab at it. Grab that and send that around. I didn't go into like terrible detail on this, but I do want to put some bumpers in place so that we stay focused. So, you know, really the difference between this conversation that we're having now and our conversations last fall is last fall we were big picture. We ended up looking at both policy and regulatory ideas, but you know, as you all know, and I'm saying this more for the benefit of our guests than those of you sitting at this table, we ended up being pretty broad and just given the scope of the conversation. So this go around, we're, I think, really tasked with a very much more focused conversation. So I've got in here that specifically we're tasked with evaluating Delta County's review processes associated with the processing of oil and gas applications, reviewing the oil and gas activities covered by Delta County's oil and gas regulations and identifying if any gaps exist, and then reviewing the performance standards for each type of activity within Delta County's oil and gas regulations and making recommendations for any appropriate additions or changes. And then to do that, I think we need to review oil and gas regulations from other jurisdictions and do some comparison and contrasting. We've done that a little bit on the performance standards side of the equation, but we haven't really done that yet on process side. So we definitely need to add that into our mix. We need to develop a set of recommendations of specific components of the regulations to adjust and guidance on how to make those adjustments. We don't need to rewrite the code. We need to create specific list of recommendations. We've got our consulting team that's doing the land use code update. They will update the code and actually write it, and then we'll provide input on that. But we need to give them some clear guidance on what we want to accomplish. So like at the very basic level, it's saying, and we've already talked about this, and this is one thing, like it's the easiest one to check off. We need to gather all of the pieces and parts into a single location rather than having to be flipping between, you know, from one page here to one page over here to one page over here within the regulations. It's so disjointed right now. We need to, at a minimum, create a single standalone chapter in this new document that covers oil and gas, covers definitions, covers process, covers performance standards, rather than cross-referencing 16 different places, which is what we have to do now. And then other recommendations that we might come up with. And then COGCC has stated multiple times that they're happy to meet, review what we're coming up with, coordinate, collaborate, provide input. So as we get something worth looking at and some ideas worth talking about, I think we need to, as a group, reach out to COGCC and invite them back to the table for some conversation. Few possible guidelines for us. Again, I think the oil and gas regulations will end up being a self-contained chapter in our new land use regulations, as opposed to being spread out throughout the whole document like it is currently. Our goal is to have a draft of the oil and gas updates ready around the same time as the land use code updates so that they can be adopted together. So our task is to be able to get recommendations to the consultant team in time to try to make that happen. We'll see how that all goes. And then ultimately, community input's gonna be critical. This group has decided to invite community input at the end of each work session, but we'll still have to have some kind of formal input process. And I don't know where that fits in yet. I think once we get a sense of how this starts to time out, we'll figure out if that's something we can line up with some of our other input opportunities, or if we need to do something that stands on its own. And we'll make that decision as we get closer to feeling like we're ready to put something out for input. On the back of your sheet, I've kind of broken it out into two phases. So phase one, really focusing in on review and discussion of our existing oil and gas process, looking at definitions, looking at the process. We've already spent a lot of time looking at performance standards, so I think we'll need to touch back into that conversation, but we'll do that after focusing on definitions and process. And then I think we need to spend more time looking at some of the oil and gas regulations of other jurisdictions, and see what we can learn from them more than we already have, including looking at their procedures more closely, identifying areas, things that we want to learn from versus approaches that we think we should avoid. And then compare and contrast those with Delta County regulations. I think there's a lot of things in our regulations that are excellent, but I think there's some good opportunities that we could take advantage of that other communities are doing. And then phase two would be really refining that list of recommendations, going through and identifying specific things that we think need to happen. And I don't know how we'll present that. Maybe it'll be a bullet pointed list. It doesn't need to be a rewrite of the code. It needs to be some kind of specific enough set of recommendations that the consultant team can interpret what we want and go and recraft the regulations, and then we'll bring it back to this group to look at. They'll bring it back here through me for that to happen. That's it. I mean, it's fairly simple, but hopefully it gives us some guidance. Hi, David.
Hey, sorry for that.
You're fine. If you'll give us a few more minutes, we're gonna just wrap up a couple other things that we're talking about, and then we'll jump into a conversation
Okay.
with you. All right. So with that, any comments? We can bring this back in our next meeting again just to finalize it, but anything in here that is out of alignment with what you were expecting or thinking and from our previous discussion? Wendell?
I've got a couple of questions. It goes back to the transportation pass-through issues that we identified in our previous reincarnation.
Yep.
Who is going to be addressing those performance standards with hazmat teams, road and bridge? Is that
I think,
staff or is that RPI?
I don't know yet. Yes, and we're so focused at a different level with the rest of this process, the rest of the land use process. We're not even there to talk about that stuff yet. I think this group needs to make recommendations around those things specific to oil and gas issue, and then it's up to the commissioners and the consultant staff to figure out if there's alignment with other things that we want to accomplish. But I think this group should focus on what they think is best for this portion of the conversation. It might actually help us with some of the other issues on the land use regulation side of the conversation. We're just not even close to that level of discussion yet.
Because that's what we identified as biggest
Yeah.
risk.
Okay. Anybody else? It's a hungry cat at David's. Anybody else have anything? Okay. All right. So I sort of envision that for this meeting today, we've obviously kind of doing a little bit of both components of phase one, which is starting the conversation, reviewing our regulations, but we're meeting with Gunnison County. We're also meeting with Gunnison Energy, and we'll get to these guys in a minute, but I've asked Gunnison Energy to come and talk to us a little bit about some of the outcomes of their spill that happened. Was that in 2016 that the spill happened? 17, and then their process with the state. Because that was a lot of our questioning is how does that exactly work? And they've gone through it. So we can learn and hear from them about that. And then also to talk with us about their experience having gone through our process recently from the applicant side of looking at the process. I can tell you staff side, and then the community is gonna be able to tell us it from their side. So it gives us kind of the full circle evaluation of our current processes, and that might give us some ideas. And then we're gonna talk with Gunnison County, and I've asked David to kind of speak to one, to listen in with this conversation with Gunnison Energy, but then also we can speak to how we collaborated and coordinated on that application, since it was, there was a Gunnison component and a Delta component, so we can share with you some of our coordination and collaboration that's been happening. So, with that, let me get the agenda back in front of me. I think we will jump to just talking about Gunnison County coordination since David is on, and what that's been looking like. That'll give you guys just a little bit more time for Carl to get where he needs to be.
He's finding a hotel right now.
Okay, and then we'll move over to that side of the room. So when we get ready to talk with Gunnison Energy, we're gonna pick up and move over there, so that we can see the screen. And give Carl's running a little late, so that'll give him a few more minutes to hit their guy to get ready to present to us. So with that, so David, are you ready?
Sure.
So what I wanted to cover with this group tonight, with our oil and gas working group, it's the same folks that were participating when you met with us last fall.
Okay.
With the exception that Patrick Dooling is representing Western Slope Conservation Center now. Since Alex left, and so Patrick's here as our Western Slope Conservation Center rep. That's the only change of who's here at the table. So we're in the process. We just started. This is our second second meeting of our regrouping, our second effort here, and we're going to be looking very specifically at Delta County's current oil and gas regulations. And this group is tasked with making recommendations of changes to those, where necessary and where appropriate, to the commissioners, which will feed into a bigger land use regulation update that we're also currently working on. So this is one component of that land use code update. Our conversations last fall were broader. We were really trying to wrap our hands around the scope. Where is the county's jurisdiction? And you're familiar with all of that since you helped participate in some of those conversations. So, but now we're really kind of getting into the nitty gritty. And this group asked if you and I could kind of share some of our recent efforts for coordination on the Gunnison Energy applications that we had, and maybe even talk a little bit about what that looks like or should look like going into the future, so that we can take that into consideration.
Okay, so please, it will sound like a foolish question. Have we got representatives of Gunnison Energy in the room?
We do. So let's do quick introductions. That's a good point. Let's go around our table and we'll go around the room and do quick introductions so you know who is here. I've been speaking, you know me, so
Wendell Coates,
Mike Cleary. Mark Waltermeyer.
Mike Ludlow with Oxbow Mining.
Patrick Dolan.
Okay?
Natasha Leger.
Lysandra Holiday.
Barrett Laverne.
Ron Hitt.
Neil Peterson with Gunnison.
Jessica Donahue.
Salar Navabian.
Did you catch all that?
Yep.
Okay, great. This little speaker thing is amazing. They're shocked at what it does every time, so.
From David's perspective, Gunnison County has been doing regulation of oil and gas operations now for almost 20 years. You know, on a scale of a weld county, we don't have nearly the number of permits they do, but we have permitted, we've issued some 160 plus separate permits for all aspects of oil and gas development. We have two companies, of which Gunnison Energy is one. And Gunnison Energy has most recently, you know, in the last year, changed who some of their folks are. And I think it would be appropriate for me to thank Gunnison Energy because the folks who came on, I think, come from a universe in which there really is no local government regulation. And they struggled, and when I say struggled, they struggled in the best sense of the word, to figure out how Gunnison County regulates and then how to accommodate their regime to include satisfying the Gunnison County requirements. So for that, there really is a thank you. And they have expressed it right back to us. It's not easy to enter into a new regulatory regime for the regulator or the regulated company. And I think we've done well. So that would be number one. Number two, I think as everybody in the room is aware, there is a bill pending in front of the Colorado legislature that would clarify, among other things, it would clarify what the regulatory authority of local governments are. And it would take that authority from being one that is, by implication, and falls under a rubric of all other regulated land uses. And it would expressly state that the local government has authority. I don't think that's going to make a difference for Gunnison County because we've litigated, and even though the source of our authority is implied, in Gunnison County, in any event, it's really been well settled. That, I think, will be a big difference for Delta County because if I'm remembering correctly, Delta County went through some similar litigation and did not have a successful result. And so I think the pending Colorado legislation is going to make a difference in clarifying what the regulatory landscape is. Gunnison County has, with regard to oil and gas, approached our regulation in an unusual way. Most land use regulation is numeric or metric, meets and bounds type requirements. And what we decided to do with the oil and gas industry, because the topography on which they operate is so varied, that we'd approach our regulatory scheme in a narrative fashion that is just in words, say what we want the outcome to be, and let the companies figure out how they want to approach satisfying that. So some of the metrics that we still have are setbacks for water bodies, but for the main, what we want is no net adverse impact. And let the company figure out how they can best approach that by their own company philosophy and by what the particular site is, and then issue the permit accordingly. What we did this last on the shot holes, it, I think, went smoothly in the end but first we had to work through an understanding, yes, there is local government regulation. Some of those requirements are going to be metric setbacks from water bodies. But for the most part, I think that one went smoothly. And I don't know what the representatives in the room from Gunnison County from Gunnison Energy would say, but they're well on their way. They have some permits in hand, and the others, I think, are well underway. If I was going to suggest a future for Delta County's regulation, and again, knowing that the state landscape is going to change, it might be that Gunnison County and Delta County, because we share topography and geography, and we actually share regulated companies, adopted something that was substantially similar to each other, so that the company didn't have to struggle through two different disparate regulatory regimes. And to that end, please, I know that my board would make me and somebody from our planning department available to Delta County just to step through in a very small scale CIS how we go about it. Does that lay the groundwork that you're looking for, Elise?
Yeah, and so I'm going to add on to that, and then maybe we could talk a little more specifically about sort of our efforts to work together. I think that so in our regulations, we've got really a very similar approach, although maybe we go about it slightly differently, since you are definitely more outcome driven, I think, in your regulations, but we definitely have taken a narrative approach as well in our regulations, as opposed to a standard-based approach. We're definitely more prescriptive or descriptive instead of prescriptive in our regulations.
Right.
But I don't know if we're always covering the same territory that you're covering. So I think I'd look to hear from you guys about some of those distinctions as having, to Gunnison Energy as having gone through both processes. And I think that the value that came out of having to go through these reviews just recently is this is all fresh and front and center. It gives us some good examples to pull from. And what I saw, going back to that early phase of the seismic project, these guys had to figure out how to, what they needed to do with us. And I agree, to their credit, they worked hard to get us the information that they needed. We've got applications currently under review that are, light years forward because of that familiarity that they have now. But I think what also came out of it, I don't know that everybody realizes how much we do work together on these kinds of projects. So we sat down 2 or 3 times on that first project, both with Forest Service, with Gunnison Energy, Gunnison County, and Delta County, all in the same room, talking about the project, learning about the project, helping these guys understand our regulations and our processes. And then after that, Neil and I, David and I, were in email and phone contact pretty much consistently throughout, so that neither of us were ever too far out in front of each other. And we were really comparing and contrasting approaches. Like, this is what I'm going to do with this, and this is what I'm going to do with that. And I think in the end, again, I'll be curious what you guys have to say, things turned out fairly similarly in terms of the outcomes from Delta County and Gunnison County. How we got there might have been a little different, but I think in the end we ended up in similar places. So I think that's good, and I think that's because of that coordination. But I think the single most important thing that happened was the day that we all went up and saw and watched and witnessed whether or not they were complying with the requirements that Gunnison had for them, or that Delta County had for them. The project was in Delta County, and I believe Neil actually came to that, didn't he?
Yes.
So Gunnison County came and watched the Delta County portion of that project, and I think that's important. We're all seeing the same things, we're all having the same experience. I think that's essential component of what's happened here, so that we're all really on the same page as we are looking at these. And So that happened, and now we've got a second round of applications that are in, and we've had that same level of coordination where we've met with Gunnison Energy, Gunnison County, Delta County Forest Service all in the same room together before the projects got started. Applications were submitted, and we're just now in the thick of reviewing, and as we get into that, we'll be coordinating with Gunnison County on our review as well. And I think you guys are in the same place where you're just now in the thick of reviewing that second round of applications. So, it is happening, and it's happening at the staff to staff level, which is appropriate, and, that on-site coordination, I think, was the most essential component of what we did with the first round, so. With that, do you mind, I'm gonna ask Solar or Jessica to kind of come, or Barrett, come up and talk
You
about it
bet.
from their side and their experience with our two processes and the
And if
difficulties.
this turns out to be consistent, then we've really been a success.
Got it?
You want to start there?
Come up here, because you're soft, Barrett.
Okay.
Your voice is quiet.
Yeah, no, obviously, I'm guessing that was the first seismic
Yeah, the 2D.
permit that Delta County's ever done.
Yeah,
So again, the development agreement is probably not likely fit for purpose, but we were able to kind of go through and analyze with a lot of land use authority and health and safety applications. We're able to sync together that the state and the federal process didn't cover. So it was a learning curve for both sides, and I'm sure there's in the future.
Elise, if somebody's speaking, if you can ask them just to be a little louder, please.
speak
Sorry, I
up.
went through the cat, sorry.
Yeah, hey David, will you put yours on mute?
Yep,
Okay. Or I can, actually, I can mute you from here.
yeah, please do.
Okay, hold on.
Sorry, I'm making a racket.
All right, there you go.
So obviously learning curve on both ends. Like we mentioned, we're able to kind of understand what your regulations and the gaps that we can fill in to satisfy the needs of the local government, local county. So that was a big step forward that I think we've really got a grasp on, and that's a lot of hard work from Elise, the folks at Delta County, and in our group here. So I feel pretty happy with where we've come to on how we move forward on projects. Obviously, we're still under analysis for a couple of them, and we look forward to providing information and transparency as needed on that process. So I don't know if you guys want to jump here either, but I mean, really, at the end of the day, for the seismic projects between Gunnison County and Delta County, we were able to suggest similar operational satisfactions that help work with both counties. So it's kind of working between the three entities, not only Gunnison Energy, but Delta County, Gunnison County, and then also with cohesion with the Forest Service, and I think that was really important as well.
So were the outcomes with Gunnison County very much different than the outcomes with Delta on that first project?
I would say not much different.
Yeah, and also I think on behalf of Gunnison Energy, we would like to thank both counties for helping us figure out this, the regulatory process in the counties. And moving forward, any projects we have, there's gonna be a lot of working with both counties. I mean, some things like well pads will be isolated amongst the counties, but we have other things that we know will cross the line, so there will be a lot of working together and partnership. And looking at the applications, the one that I'm working on right now, FYI, it is mostly a lot of the similar points. So it's noxious weeds, protecting water, protecting soils, identifying affected landowners and making sure they're notified. So I don't think there's been, different format, but I think the main points are very similar across county, which makes it easier to work with.
Are you seeing that in the 3D project that is under review now too, that the criteria and the information that you're providing in the proposed mitigation is lining up as well? Because the 3D project is a little different than the 2D project had been.
Absolutely, yeah. There's a lot of similarities, and we can obviously go into more details on that, but I don't have them all in front of me. But I think the simple answer is yeah, which is makes it easy to work between the two.
Questions? You've got a captive audience of several people here. Wendell?
This is Wendell Coates, Dave. I have two questions, for either Jessica or Barrett. Was there any regulatory redundancies that could be streamlined in the Delta County, Gunnison County Forest Service process? That was one of the things that, at least I identified early on, is we don't need to be just developing paper, just to say to have it in the file.
No, that's a really good point, and that's something we should definitely look at in detail and come back to simply setbacks and those kind of things. Yeah, that's something that there's, different levels of authority and regulation, just as long as we're not having duplicative process, I think that'd be helpful.
And the same would go for timing, so that, comment periods run consecutively, and so that people are all on the same page at the same time. We don't have Gunnison County running the public comment period last month, and we're trying to do it this month.
That's one of my concerns, is trying to make sure the timing all works so that, because if I'm gonna permit a well per se, I'm gonna have a COGCC permit for downhole, a BLM permit for downhole, I'm gonna have NEPA analysis for the surface, I'm gonna have a COGCC permit for surface, and then I will have county permits for the surface as well. So trying to make sure that things can run concurrently so that it's all happening at once. With as much coordination as possible, but it gets a little chicken and the egg when this agency wants to see what this one's approval looks like, and this agency wants to see what this one's COAs would look like, and so kind of figuring out how we can work so that it's all.
Because that's also confusing to the public when there's multiple comment periods, and they don't know what they're commenting on. This is supposed to be fact-based, not popularity contest.
And also it gets hard if it's, you start here with one permit, and you work through this one, and then we do try to grow as an operator, and so if during this public comment, there's a lot of concerns, we'll adapt and we'll mitigate that for the next application. Well, then it confuses the public, and they're commenting on something entirely different than what they saw the first round, because we're trying to improve and we're trying to be better. So that part also gets confusing.
How do we work that in, Lise?
I don't know yet. I think that's something for us to talk about, how we align our review process with other agencies. I think part of that is looking at, Gunnison's process, timelines, looking at ours and looking at Forest Service, and it is confusing. The Forest Service released their conditions of approval, their draft conditions of approval, right as we were getting ready to go to our first public meeting. And we aren't even to that level of detail in our review yet. And so I don't know that the public understands that there's sort of one process is happening here and the next one comes in and then the third one comes in, and things do get stacked up. And I think we do need to figure out how to unstack that for people and better communicate expectations of how and where the public participates in the multiple layers. There's an education component there. So.
I think kind of along that same vein, how revisions to the permit or to the project are handled. I think that was an issue the first go around back in October, where the project sort of shifted size and scope and throughout, and I think that was something that just made the process even trickier to follow. So I think within these comment windows or whatever we're looking at for this process, making sure that if there's significant revisions that have to be made by the project, that they're being sufficiently communicated throughout the process.
Anyone else have questions for David or Gunnison Energy on this issue of coordination? And just our.
Well, I guess one question I have that's different between Delta County and Gunnison County is that Gunnison County has extended jurisdiction on federal lands and Delta County doesn't. And so how have you been communicating relative to that difference, or coordinating relative to that difference?
David, Bill, chime in on this, but I think that Oh, you can't. Sorry, David. Hold on, I'm unmuting you. Now, you're unmuted
Yeah,
now.
and Elise, I couldn't hear that comment, so please you'll have to repeat it.
The question was, one of the big differences between our regulations and your regulations is that you have asserted local control on federal lands. And
Yes.
Delta County has not. And it's not that we haven't asserted it, we are only reviewing, Delta County is only looking at off-site impacts. So if, really roads being the primary thing, but I think that extends to irrigation, to agricultural irrigation related infrastructure that crosses, multiple property owners, like pipe or ditches and pipelines and things like that. So, what we've done, I think, to address that is, looking at the conditions of approval, and honestly, I don't know yet, because we're doing that right now, because the first project, the 2D project, was private lands only. So, this is a guess. I think what we do is we look at those conditions of approval that the Forest Service has issued, and, we look at what the state requires, through Reg 333, and if we feel like there's a gap that isn't addressing, those off-site impacts, we look to fill it appropriately and with whatever mitigation might be worked out with the applicant. On private lands, on the private land component of that, I think what we have to do then is determine if that condition, if that approach, whether it's a setback or, setbacks being the easiest example probably, is that the appropriate setback on private land too, to create that consistency. If it's not the appropriate setback, why? And then I think we have to figure out what else we would rather do. But I think for us in our coordination, it's looking to Reg 333 for this particular application type and looking at those conditions of approval and seeing where we can align with them and build off of them versus identifying if we feel there's a gap that fits in with our wheelhouse, which for us is just offsite impacts. So.
For Gunnison County, maybe the most important, there are two steps, but maybe the more important of the two is in the Forest Service conditions of approval. There was a statement that the Forest Service would not be issuing a permit unless and until the requisite county permit was issued as well. So the county approval became a prerequisite for the forest.
Yeah.
The second step would be, because Gunnison County and the forest and Delta County and the forest and the three of us work well together, the process that we followed with the Forest Service was a series of meetings with their staff and with the regulating company, and tried to hash out exactly how we could get across the finish line together successfully. I think traditionally, when there are multiple government jurisdictions involved, the question of preemption comes into play, and we really tried to avoid creating preemption issues by working together and doing consistent, if not congruent, conditions.
I agree. And to that condition of approval, again, for us, we only did the private lands on the 2D project, so it hasn't happened yet, but in our public meeting last week, for the seismic projects, that was one of the questions that came up that we discussed. The county could choose to issue the go-ahead on the private lands and issue conditions of approval about Forest Service sign-off and finalization, in regards to the rest of it too, that using those conditions of approval to help the timing between all the jurisdictions line up, so.
That question will become more complicated, I think, for Delta County.
Yeah, I agree.
And I think the complication, one of the complications, I don't know that people have seen yet. You've got municipalities that have municipal water supply intake outside of their municipal border. And essentially, in Colorado, a municipality can exert regulatory control 3 miles up gradient from the intake. And So it is an extraterritorial authority that I don't know municipalities in Delta County have yet recognized, or if they have, I don't know that they have chosen to exercise it.
Any
The
other
answer to
questions?
that is yes, we have.
To which question, to which part?
We've never had to, but we could.
I was just trying to understand, I heard the word assert itself over federal regulation, and, that's a pretty wide definition of assert. So, can you focus on what you mean by where you've asserted yourself over federal enforced, service?
Did you hear that, David?
No, I did not, I'm sorry.
That's okay. The question is, the word assert yourself over Forest Service, that's pretty broad. What, can you be more specific about what that looks like in your regulations over the Forest Service lands?
So please, what that extraterritorial authority of municipalities, or just generally how we apply our regs on federal land?
The second, right?
The second, yeah, because you started that by saying you've asserted your authority over the feds, and the last time I heard that was the Civil War. Didn't play out too well, so I was just curious, how you define assert and how I define assert are probably two different things, so I'm just curious, when you use that word assert, what you mean.
Did you catch that, David? Got quiet talkers. So, David, I think the question really is about how you apply your regulations on federal land, and what do you mean when you say you assert your regulations on federal land?
We don't treat an operation differently on federal land than private land. We impose our regulatory requirements the same.
I have a question for you. David, this is Wendell Kuntz again. What happens when one of your regulations is in conflict with a federal regulation then? Who has preemption on that?
Are you not hearing us, David?
Please, I'm not hearing the question.
The follow-up question was, what happens then when your regulation is in conflict with the federal regulation? Who has jurisdiction?
Annalise, you'll just have to translate it, it's
Yep.
okay.
That's fine. I've got the loud voice.
Yeah.
So so what happens when you're in conflict, when your regulation's in conflict with the federal government's? Who wins?
Well, we could spend about a week talking about that. What we try to do is avoid that conflict. What we would say would be that the Forest Service is a floor, and we can go above that floor, particularly for things that are public health and safety. Others would say that there are any number of ways that the federal government can preempt us. They can preempt us by expressly saying, this is for us, the Forest Service, to regulate and not for you. They can regulate us by implication, which means a reasonable person looking at a side-by-side comparison of the rules says they have control and we don't. And then there is a third way of preemption called an operational conflict, where if our county requirement were imposed, it would do such, in layman's words, severe damage to the applicant's chances of moving forward that we are preempted. The hope, at least, and that preemption argument has three levels: the federal government, the state government, and the local government. Some would also say that it's just like three dogs, and the biggest dog, the federal government, will preempt the state and local government, and that the second dog, the state, will preempt local government. All of those arguments have been made in various courts, and courts have come to different conclusions. What we're trying to do is avoid those clashes by working with the Forest Service and having our conditions be consistent.
By coordinating and working to be on the same page on the front end.
That's correct.
Okay.
And so, you know, I really don't want to opine about who wins, because it's not the current culture that we have with the Forest Service. Our culture is to try to do it up front together.
Any other questions for our crew here?
I guess it's more an observation than a question, because it's back to confusion for the public with various comment periods and also various regulations across state, local, and federal. And so I don't know that I've got a good solution for that. I just think it's complicated, but when you have a comment period for all three at the same time, that's also equally confusing to the public, especially when you have different standards across each one. So absent there being the same requirements and standards across the board, I don't know how you necessarily solve that problem. And I'd be curious from your perspective, when you have different standards across the different jurisdictions, which one do you go after first in your permitting process? Do you go after the one that is most lax or the one that's most stringent?
From a regulation standpoint, we would not submit based on lax versus stringent. It's usually more based upon anticipated processing time. So it could be super lax, but if it's something where COGCC has set timeframes, so I know it's gonna be, you know, this many days. So I need, you know, so we pick the day we want our project to be fully approved, and we count back from there. So it's not you pick the easy one or the hard one, you try to time it to match your timeframes. So a lot of times with an EA, you start your EA process, you let that go for a while, because the EA and the NEPA process percolates on its own. And then when you get towards the latter half of an EA, that's when I would start submitting APDs for federal, and probably for COGCC, and now for county. So now that we're, you know, so it wouldn't be just Delta County's easy, so I'll just wait till the last second to get that in. That's not fair to release. I try not to be the person that has to call and beg for the favor. I call it percolating naturally. So I try to understand their time frame, add a little buffer, and that's when I submit, to make sure that I'm not begging her the day after I submitted, please, please, please look at it, please, please, I need it right now. So that's how I look at it.
And in the planning world, the way it's really what she's saying, but we'll have flow charts and top of flow charts on what if statements, right? Like constantly, this goes down, this gets delayed, what happens to the next one? So it's a constant loop of Gantt charts. We've got 10 pages of them, just in case we don't get past the Delta piece, what happens to the other piece. So they're always connected in some way because of timing. So it's a really tough question, because they're all going down different paths almost, but they're affecting each other in some way, shape, or form. I think the best way, as far as an educational, we're starting an educational process, is go through literally flow charts of all these different things we're doing, and how that simplified flow chart could look by things falling apart or moving forward in the next phase after each of them. Because it's complex for us too. I mean, not for her, but for me still, actually. It's complex for you too. So that's what we're dealing with constantly on this. It's not a very easy answer to give, because there's so many of them.
And it's that balance of, you know, the confusion. So if I start an EA, you know, a new one's tomorrow, and I went ahead and I sent in my Delta County permits and my Gunnison County permits, well, that's not gonna work, because by the time the EA is approved, they'll have expired, or it'll have adapted, cause, you know, you put out your first project, well, then you're gonna improve and refine and hone it to the better project. So I'd rather wait till we're close to that final better project to start submitting to the other agencies and giving them final paperwork, so that they have the benefit of stuff we've already fixed that might have been obviously wrong way back over here. So,
I think the one thing we can all agree on is that it's complicated on all sides.
it's a lot of moving parts, yes.
And it's not intentional on our part. As far as what happened with the EA last year, what happened with the seismic, there's explanations for each of them, and it was us coming in really quick on the seismic piece, obviously having a learning curve on Delta and Gunnison, then backtracking, going to the 2D on both sides of it. The EA piece, obviously, we're gonna talk about tomorrow, but the previous team had a design, we revamped that design. It wasn't intentional, it was something that we thought technically needed to happen. It's just not intentional, there's just a lot of moving parts, is the bottom line. But how do we change that view? Because there is a communication way of doing that. Because we have a lot more knowledge, obviously, from what could happen in timing. And you're probably gonna be way more confused than us, even though it's complex for us even. So.
Anything else? All right, why don't we take a 5-minute break, and we'll get set up over here, and we can all go sit down and, over there, we'll just take a few minutes to reconvene. David, you're welcome to stay on and listen to this if you want. Entirely up to you. We're gonna just hear an update on Gunnison Energy and the spill that happened and their process with the state.
Okay, then I'm gonna bid you guys a good night, and thank you for having me on so far.
Hold on one second, David, what was that, Natasha?
Well, how Gunnison County coordinated on this bill.
Oh,
as
are
well,
you,
So he should probably.
are you able to stay on?
Sure.
Okay, Natasha wants to hear from you on your guys' piece of the spill coordination as well.
So when we do, whoever is speaking, if you can put them real close to a microphone, it would help.
Okay,
But I will stay on, yes,
okay,
indeed.
great. I'm gonna put you on mute.
Carl Umland's our head of engineering. We're gonna have another meeting in Delta tomorrow, and we'll go through the team a little bit more. But we started in July of 18, and this spill happened before we got there. One of the things that Brad, the previous CEO, did say was that he called Dave on the phone, Baumgarten, I think before even COGCC. So one of the things that Brad was great about, because he's got 15 years of time, was to work with the county. So that was obviously a learning curve for us. But what happened here was there were 2 spills off of risers, off of the pipeline on the water line. No hydrocarbon, it was produced water. One of them were caught with the drone,
Yes.
and the other one wasn't. We obviously submitted all the information, the timeline. COGCC looked at it. They wanted us to repair both risers. We looked at every single riser across the entire, I think, 30 miles of pipeline water lines that we've got. We went forward and actually replaced them or repaired all of them, just to plan for the future. So this is just a prelude for. We had about 150 slides. We don't have that much time tonight, so we've dropped this to about 50 slides or so. Go ahead,
It's a
Carl.
lot of pictures, don't worry.
Yeah, it's a lot of pictures. Go ahead, Carl.
Okay, yeah, can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, just speak up. This sounds good, though.
Okay. So yeah, no, it's a great intro, Solar. Like you kind of mentioned, we came in the middle of last year, and the latest of these 2 spills had just happened a few months prior to our joining the team. So it was kind of a working backwards from what had happened, reactively instead of being proactive, which is where we're at today. So yeah, slide 1, I'm assuming you guys are able to look at it. The outline, I'm going to give you guys kind of a little bit more of a detailed overview of the executive summary. And then really in detail walk you through the narrow spill, which is the more recent spill. And then kind of recap the DGU spill as well. There's 2 separate water spills that we had, but probably just cover that one in a lot less detail because it's roughly the same process for both of them that we went through. Speak through the failure, like the solution on how to mitigate it, root cause, all that kind of stuff, and then the actual execution of the work, and then the final result. So you guys a clear picture of what happened, why, and then what we actually fixed. So I'll just jump into it real quick. So slide 2, executive summary. Bottom line is we've done a very extensive set of operational changes to the field to be proactive, not reactive, and above the COGC regulations, just to make sure that we feel comfortable with how it should be handled, not just meeting the letter of the law. So those 2 images on the right, the top one is the DGU spill, picture of it, and we have a ton more to visually kind of elaborate on that. And then the bottom one is the narrows. So the DGU spill, these both happened within 3 miles of each other on the same portion of the infrastructure we have in what we like to call our southeastern portion of the field, and it's DGU Dead Man Gulch Federal Unit. The DGU spill was about 50 barrels of water that spilled, and it's kind of a sad rationale as to what happened, but simply put, there was an open valve that got knocked open physically, and that's why it had the leak. It's been 100% cleaned up. We've done the full field-wide riser repair that Bart mentioned, and gotten through all the regulatory stuff with the COGCC. We spent about $71K on the cleanup itself, and then we paid an incremental fine of about $203,000 to the state. But up to this point, it's been fully resolved. We'll jump into details on that one. The other one was the Narrows, again, directionally about 2 miles north on the same infrastructure system on the water line. And it was about a 10-barrel spill of just pure produced water. Like Laura mentioned, there's no hydrocarbons at all that was spilled out. And this one was actually a mechanical failure. There was a riser, a vertical tube that comes off of the water line itself that relieves gas pressure in the water line, and it failed. And again, we fully mitigated that and cleaned it up. We spent a little under $100,000 cleaning that one up, and then paid $145,000 fines to the state for that one. And again, we'll jump into the details about it. The main actions taken that were required by the COGC are fairly straightforward and obvious, but just to be clear about them, it's essentially to treat all the soils that were damaged and to replace and fix any of the impacts to the surface area with regards to vegetation and landscape and that sort of thing. There's now a requirement with the state to do regular inspections of the pipelines. So that's something we're doing. And then essentially to get resolution with the COGCC to report the spill, to get the fine, the NOAB, and to take action based on that. So that's what happened that the COGC required. What we ended up doing was a little bit above and beyond that. So we actually did a full audit of our pipeline and our riser system. So just think about getting all of the details and information about every single riser and every single piece of pipe. So we understood what we had in the field, and then to do an exhaustive review of what to do to make it non-likely to fail. We also spent a little over $100,000 on fixing all of the risers above and beyond all the dollar amounts you guys see up there. What we essentially did, like the Flora said, is we proactively redid all the risers, regardless of the likelihood of failure, to be a consistent setup that is nothing in the world foolproof, but probably just one notch below it, pretty much foolproof in terms of being able to have any of these issues or anything remotely related to leaks and mechanical failures. And then finally, we basically put in a set of standard operating procedures, both in the unfortunate event if we ever have a spill again, the process to handle it, and as well how we're going to maintain and mitigate the pipelines moving forward. So we kind of put these standard procedures in place. We're still fanning this out in more detail, but we at least have those first pieces put together. This year, we plan on elaborating on that and being a little bit more robust on how we do that. So that's kind of a high level. Again, I'm going to jump into the narrows with a lot of details, so stop me if I'm going too fast or too slow. So the narrow spill, like I kind of mentioned, was likely caused by a valve connection breaking. and it was roughly in the first to second quarter of 2018 when that occurred. And again, it was off of a 6-inch water line, and it was on the GE side of our pipeline. We have a gas and a water pipeline, and this is on the water leg of that system. Theoretically, this happened actually on the surface of SG, our operating partner to the east. Their federal unit is called Bull Mountain, and technically this happened just on the other side of our federal unit, DGU, Denman Gulch unit, and on their side of the road. Nick Hughes was the surface owner that this impacted, and like I had shared, it was roughly 10 barrels, and it covered about 3,000 square feet of contaminated soil. So we essentially caught it in May through our drone inspection. And I have a video of it, but it's way too large of a file size to physically share, so I would maybe follow up to you guys later and share with you on the thumb drive. But the drone caught it in May, and we basically mitigated it between May and August of this year, this prior year, sorry. And just did the full execution of the plan. And I'll walk through that in detail with y'all in terms of what that specifically means. But this is basically the chronology of what happened in October through November. We basically did our design fix above and beyond the May to August mitigation that the COGCC required. And then in December, we had a final set out with the COGCC and got resolution of it. So if you go to slide 5, the kind of the who, what, where, when, why, like we're sharing who's Gunnison Energy's water pipeline on Nick Hughes' land and Dan / Hawker. Dan's our field friend, and Hawker was the contract operator running the drones because we didn't have licenses at the time to do so. So that's who found this. And what, like I had mentioned, it's a ball valve off of the water leg of the system that caused the 10 barrels of spill, roughly in a 20 by 115 foot stretch of stuff. Where, like I said, Bull Mountain, there's a red arrow down the bottom right map that shows specifically where it is. All those weird shapes and colors is essentially Gunnison's acreage, with the exception of that green colored acreage. That's essentially SG's Bull Mountain acreage where it happened. Like I said, it happened in May of last year, and basically a saltwater spill or just a freshwater spill that had a crack valve connection. So if you go to slide 6, it just highlights where it was happened again in a little bit more detail. If you jump to slide 7, we have regular drone inspections in place, and what was very, very unfortunate is that when we did the inspection on March of 2018, the orange is where our drone was able to physically get to and cover the pipeline. The just gray, smaller, thin line is where the drone was not able to go, and it was just due to weather in March. As you guys know, it was a pretty snowy, muddy month, and we just physically could not get access to certain portions of the pipeline. And unfortunately, this leak literally happened, as you can see down there, where there's a gap of orange, is where that narrow spill happened. So it unfortunately went over the one spot we didn't get a drone over. Like I said, Hawker noticed the actual failure, and Dan went out to work with it. And if you go to slide 8, you'll see what we're able to do now, which is just full coverage of our pipeline with the drone. And on slide 8, it kind of shows that that's when we picked it up in May instead of March when we do these quarterly inspections. Slide 9 shows you the actual riser leak spill area. This is obviously after we found it, we started to excavate it. As you can see, the pipe to the left on slide 9 is a water riser, and it's just a 2-inch tubing valve that comes up out of the 6-inch horizontal pipeline that's below the dirt there. And on the right of that is the gas riser. And so each pipeline has a riser to take out the phase that's not supposed to be there. So in an instance of the water pipeline, we have a 2-inch gas riser coming off of it to bleed off the gas from the system. And then the opposite for the gas line. There is a 2-inch water line coming off of it to bleed off the water. There's pretty much no issues ever with the gas side of it. that same stuff. And on the right, you can actually see the little box where the actual riser was and where it spilled. And on the left is some of the environmental consulting we did with Entrada, where they basically take all the measurements of the topography and they figure out what the impacts are and how to mitigate it. So if you jump to slide 12, these are just visuals to show you what the spill looked like when we caught it. So the left image shows you the downslope where the leak happened and obviously the adverse impacts to the vegetation. It's essentially a little salty water. If you look at the chemical composition of water it's just produced, it just has a higher set of chlorine and TDS in it. So it's just salty water, and obviously the vegetation likes a little bit of pressure water, and that's why it kills off the vegetation. Slide 13 is another view looking downslope. The left one is immediately finding the issue, and the right one is a little bit later, when it dried up a little bit. Slide 14 actually shows you the actual valve and the actual failure. So that valve on top there, that rusted looking metal piece of iron is a ball valve that essentially lets you open and close it if you want to bleed off water out of the system. And that's essentially where the failure occurred. Slide 15 shows you that failure in a lot more detail. And if you actually just want to jump to slide 16, it shows it in as much detail as you can get. Essentially the threads for the connection between the 2-inch riser and the ball valve itself, the baseline ball valve, literally froze and split the mechanical seal of the connection to the ball valve itself. So that's where it failed, and we'll walk through the how and why and the kind of root cause failure analysis. I just want to give you a sense of what that looked like. Slide 17 is kind of the before when we came on location, and slide on the right is essentially the after, showing you what it should have looked like. And it's a small nuance. It's obviously just tilted to the left a little bit where it cracked. So if you go to slide 18, now that we've kind of identified failure and what happened, we kind of went through the key stakeholders, and this is a part of our standard operating procedure, is to mitigate what happens and why. Essentially, I have a series of contractors, Hawker with the inspections and the design fixes. High Country did most of the man labor to get it actually cleaned up. Entrada and ALS were the two different environmental groups that did the soil/water sampling to ensure that no water impacts happen and that sort of thing. And we'll go into it in a little bit more detail, but in short, this is obviously a really bad thing to happen, and we're not pleased that we joined the team with these issues, but the benefit of it, or the positive note, was it wasn't by any major water sources at all, so nothing was impacted related to anything besides the soil that we did impact. Obviously, the regulatory bodies, BLM, CGCC, and then in this case, because it happened in Gunnison County, Gunnison County, the accused, and then our team. So those are the major stakeholders we identified in the process. Slide 19 through 21 are essentially the chronology of what happened. And I can go into this in more detail, so apologize if I go too quickly through it, but it essentially starts on slide 19 for the chronology with May, the leak identified, and basically go to find everybody within the first 24 to 48 hours. Immediately after that, you basically get samples of soil to do a control group and then a contaminated group, and then you essentially have to take the soil contaminated and bring it back up to snuff from the control group that wasn't impacted. So the month of May and June, what we essentially did was start cleaning it up and filing the proper regulatory permits, so not permits, I thought, it's the regulatory paperwork with the COGCC. So we filed Form 27, basically saying what we're going to do and how we're going to do it. Form 19 is essentially the beginning of that sampling process, and I'll show some slides on that. It says, hey, this is our baseline that we have to fix the soil back to. If you go to slide 20, it's just kind of elaborating on the process. We essentially had COGCC out several times throughout the process to monitor our mitigation efforts and our cleanup efforts. pulling out about 600 tons of soil to a environmental soil disposal site, continue to take samples and clean it. Again, like Solar mentioned, roughly in July is when we joined the team, and I got brought up to speed about all this stuff. And essentially, it's just a series of scraping the dirt off, cleaning it up, and then testing it. And we went through 2 rounds of that through July, and then into August. And then we basically got thumbs up from the CUGCC in August that it was all cleaned up and back to code. And we ended up doing our much more intensive mitigation that we'll go through here in a bit more detail. That goes way beyond just cleaning up the incident itself, but proactively changing our business operations to prevent this kind of thing from happening again. We essentially spent October through December doing that, and then meeting with the CUGCC to show them not only the standard requirements, but what we had done above and beyond to make sure this never happened again. Slide 22 is an importance to showing the cost of what we did. Slide 23 is the same thing, but this is defined with the state. Slide 24 is where we're going to get into the actual cleanup effort and what we did. Slide 25 just simply shows the procedure. I'm happy to get into this with you guys a little bit more, but it's kind of just the algorithm if, God forbid, we ever have a spill again of what we do and how we do it so that everybody's wildly clear and that we can improve upon the process. Slide 26 is going to now get into the details of what the environmental work we worked with Entrada on. What they essentially do is they lay out the water wells and to make sure that we don't have anything within a certain distance. As you can see here, nothing within a mile radius hit the radar except for obviously our own oil and gas wells. So it was immediately determined that there was no impact to any water sources from a water well perspective. Slide 27 highlights the wetlands and the soil buckets setups. And essentially all Entrada's doing with these is getting these baselines of what water sources are where, and if we impacted them in any way whatsoever. And as you can see here, again, nothing with even a quarter mile was impacted at all. So we were at a very, very safe distance from impacting anything related to anything but the soil itself. Slide 28 shows you that sampling process I had mentioned. Essentially what you do is you sample a control, and then the others are the actual impact itself. So that HB-VG1 dot that's in the middle, that's not in the middle of the that orange and white cross-hatching is the control sample. Essentially what we need to get the soil brought back up to quality-wise. And then those 4 points are essentially where we impacted the soil. We need to get each of those 4 samples up to code. So slide 29 essentially shows you that. It's a ton of stuff on the slide, but just know that each one of the rows represents a chemical, and the ones that are highlighted in yellow do not meet the CUGCC regulations in terms of quality of the soil, and they also aren't meeting the control point that I had shown on the previous slide. So it's kind of a combination of the soil is just not okay, period, and the soil is not the same as the control sample site. So what we do is we clean it and remove it essentially through time. And if you go to slide 30, you essentially see that the left side shows early time and the right side shows late time. The yellow cells are the cells that highlight a chemical that's not meeting the criteria. And then through time, as we sample it and we keep removing stuff, we get all the soil samples back to those specs. So essentially, Entrada is in charge of that, and Gunnison, the CUGCC has to sign off on it. So we're really not involved with it. We just do the work. The environmental third party group dictates it's good, and then they share it with the CUGCC, and then the CUGCC ultimately blesses that mitigation. Does that make sense? And it's kind of a busy slide, but it's fairly straightforward in terms of just trying to get stuff clean.
How's the timing?
So,
do we have about 5 more minutes, 10 more minutes?
I'm sorry, I can't hear.
Sorry, Carl, I'm just asking the timing of the room.
I would say 5 more minutes, that gives us time for some Q&A, and then we want to save 10 to 15 minutes.
I literally can't hear.
You have 5 more minutes.
apologize.
Should we hit the root cause or the standard operating procedure? What should we hit up the last 5 minutes? Do you want to hit up the? I guess I'm not sure if we need to go through the other spill in more detail, but do you want to get to the conclusion maybe, Carl?
Yeah, you're super funny. I think you said I want to kind of speed it up to get to the results.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yep. No, I can definitely do that. There's only 18 slides left of content. So visually, as you can see on slide 31, it's just us mitigating the soils. Slide 32, I won't get into this in detail, but we do kind of a 7 hows, 5 whys, and it's just basically trying to determine why it failed and how. And going through this in a lot of detail on slides 32 and 33, the ultimate conclusion is that it failed from water getting into the 2-inch riser and causing the valve to crack. And actually, the valve thread to crack. So that's the simple dimple on what we did. And again, we spent a lot of engineering time trying to do that root cause to get to that point. So that's pretty much it related to the narrow spill. What happened and all that kind of stuff. Slide 34, this is just starting off into the DGU one. I won't go into this one in a lot of detail, but essentially it was the same kind of failure, but it was earlier in time. It was in 2017, and it happened about 2 miles south of where the narrow spill was, and it was on the same waterway line as the other spill was. If you go to slide 36, that directly shows you that, where it happened and that sort of thing. Unfortunately, it's happened on John Hotchkiss's land, and it was in our acreage, in our DGU area, and it was the same kind of saltwater spill. Slide 37 is just showing that we do regular pipeline tests, and that it passed previously, so we didn't notice the failure then. So those are the 2 spills and what happened. Slide 39 is basically walking you guys through the fix of that. So we essentially looked at our entire field and did an audit to understand what we had and where and what the composition was. Just know that we had 22 locations that have risers in them, and there were 18 risers for the water line that's clearly the weak point, or was the weak point in our system. So we essentially documented all the different types we had. Looking at slide 40, we basically went, okay, we have all these different types of risers in all these different places. Slide 41 kind of shows you what they look like, just so you can get a sense of the slide showing the green underneath the dirt there is the 6-inch water line, and then that piece of iron coming out of it, that's the riser. We just understood the composition of the field in terms of the mechanical natures of each different valve setup. Slide 42 just highlights what that looks like. I won't walk you guys through all the different valve types, but the bottom line is we documented what the valves were and how all the risers were set up, and we decided to move to a standard setup. So if you move to slide 43, we essentially went through all the options in the world, more than the ocean, if you will, on how to fix them and how to fix them right. And slide 44 just shows you what an example is from our neighbor to the east, SG. And slide 45 shows you cathodic protection that we already had, but we're installing more of, and it really just helps protect the line from any classical corrosion of the metal itself. So slide 46 just shows after we thought through all this stuff and spent a lot of time, we came up with a right way to do it. Any solution was identified, and as Solar mentioned, we just decided to unilaterally replace all of the riser setups so that there isn't any ability for it to fail the way it did at all anymore in 100% capacity. Slide 48 basically just shows you the execution of it. We decided to dig up all the risers and to replace shut the valve at the base of the line so the water can't get into them. And for a majority of them, we decided to put valve cans around them to protect them from freezing and from anybody physically hitting them or breaking them again. Slide 49 just kind of shows you that infrastructure system. Slide 50 highlights the actual audit of the pipeline and the risers itself. And then slide 51 kind of shows you the designs and what that final product ends up looking like. And it's pretty simple. It's just a 2-inch riser that has a valve and then a double set of protection for its failure. valve so that it can't be opened, and then a thread valve, needle valve connection on the top of it so that it's dual redundancy. And below the surface is where we also shut them in with another valve. So there's basically 3 sets of valves and or stop gaps in place so that there pretty much can't be any failures. We essentially did the project and executed it on slide 52. And all it's showing you is the green circles are where we dug up the riser and we put a valve can around it. The blue circles are where we dug it up and we just closed the valves. So that again, there's this triple redundancy on water leakage. And the red ones are where we didn't do anything simply because they're gas lines that have no water in them at all. So there's clearly no ability to have a water spill in those. Slide 53 is just the drones that we're doing now. Jessica is a certified pilot for drones. And so she is proactively going out on a regular basis related to our operations to inspect the line. To me, this is a little bit more reactive than proactive. The rest of the work we did was the proactive part, but we are still going to do this part as well, kind of concurrently with major operations. Slide 55 just basically walks us through the execution of the project and what we did. Slide 56 shows you what the heck I'm talking about. Slide 56 is a guard barrier around the riser, a valve can protecting the water and the gas, and the left side with a little orange cone on top is the cathodic protection for that entire system, so that there's no, that wasn't a part of the failure, but that was a part of our solutions to make sure we were protecting the line as much as we could. So essentially slide 56 shows you a finished product. Slide 57 is the exact same thing, except this is an instance where we did not put a valve can around it just because we don't plan on using this specific location very much. And the only difference between the two is that the previous slide is more accessible to operate the valves, but they're both mechanically set up the exact same way, where there's a dual redundancy on the valves, both below grade and above grade, so that nothing can fail. And then slide 58 is just visually showing you on the top left the actual valve setup. It's our standard for the field now. It's the lock valve and threaded needle valve connection. The upper right hand image is just showing them installing the actual riser connection and doing the cathodic protection. And then the bottom right image is essentially showing you what the cathodic protection looks like, just to give you some visuals of what the final products are. But that's it in a nutshell. I know I handed through fairly quickly. Do you guys have any questions?
I know Carl mentioned the mitigation through drones that Jessica's now running. Maybe make a few comments, Jessica, about how we're going to be going above and beyond and do it quite often.
Yes, so we're not only going to do it just quarterly or what have you for pipeline inspections, but also when we have active operations, if we're doing any kind of pipeline testing, flow testing, things like that, I'll also be out there to make sure that we have eyes on all the ground as much as possible while anything else is happening.
And when she goes out there, there's typically myself or someone else, so there's several eyes looking and driving and surveying. So just wanted to make that comment.
And so what are you looking for, or what is the drone picking up?
So it's just a visual inspection of the pipeline routes. Majority of our pipelines are co-located with roads, so we do have field personnel that are on those roads daily. So they also do a daily inspection, but the drone assists us in areas where you can't drive, where it might go cross-country or roads that we don't typically access.
So when you're looking at that drone footage, you're manually looking for?
Yes, you manually look for something out of the ordinary.
You don't do change detection with prior footage?
Yeah, and I apologize if I'm talking over anybody. The hearing's a little difficult, but what's really important to me is that what we're going to be doing going forward that really hasn't been done is we're going to be doing regular pressure tests of our entire system, both the gas and the water side. So doing the regular drone inspection is going to be helpful, but I think it's going to be the most critical for us is just to physically test the system every year when we do major operations to ensure that there's mechanical integrity throughout the system.
Did that answer your question, Natasha?
No, I was just curious as to whether you do change detection from prior footage.
What exactly is that?
That's software on imagery
Oh, it's a
analysis?
specific software?
Yeah.
I haven't heard it, we can look into it.
We can look into that, yeah.
I mean,
haven't-
especially for areas where it's not accessible, it would be helpful if you actually had that.
We'll look into that, because, yeah.
That algorithm, it just can see it, it can see a difference, and then
So it's software that basically detects any changes from the previous imagery. It's an imagery analysis software. eCognition is one of them.
that's great.
But yeah, just to emphasize what Carl's saying there, we're gonna test the system next year, so that's very important. So we'll have comfort very soon that everything tests well.
So it seemed like you did pretty extensive soil testing in the area, and you mentioned that, you know, you identified the existing groundwater infrastructure in the area and, you know, determined there was no, I guess, threat to the groundwater. Did you do water sampling concurrent with this spill?
Gunnison Energy has had a very robust groundwater sampling program throughout the whole project area for over a decade, so. So yes, I think there were samples pulled. We have plenty of samples from before as the baseline, and I think samples were pulled afterwards.
Did you notice any changes throughout the?
Not that I'm aware of.
I have a question. May I ask a question?
Sure.
I was a little confused there. Carl said it was in the produced water that it was mostly just high in salt, maybe a little chlorine, but I saw on one of the slides that the reason the soil was removed is that it was tested high for diesel organics.
Can you hear that, Carl?
Can you repeat the question? I apologize. I heard something about soil sampling slide.
In the soil sampling, there, it did test, some of it did test positive for diesel organics.
Yeah, I can. That's like super choppy, I'm sorry. One lady was talking, I could hear her really well earlier, but.
Carl, she was asking on some of those results on the soil samples that, one of those tests had diesel organics. That obviously was, I guess, one of the orange or yellow highlighted sections up there. Is that from the chemicals, from the CBM wells, or?
Yeah, so that actual, with the diesel, it's basically that they sensed oil, is what that kind of indicates. And honestly, I can't speak to exactly what it represents. It could be from a multitude of things, but I feel like, based on the fact that if you look at diesel on there, it like tested really high for the first time we did it, and then every subsequent test, it would be immediately really low. It kind of just feels like a bit of an anomaly in terms of what showed up, but yeah, I can't speak to exactly what that represented when it came out in that soil sample. Just because we weren't really involved with this in the beginning.
But it wasn't from the formation, because the diesel wouldn't be from the rock.
No, it's something, it's a truck, it's something like that, because we don't make any, hydrocarbons in this area, it's just gas and water.
It'd be from the connection or something physically from, that got into the line possibly, that was from the wells, downstream, upstream.
So the produced water does contain.
It's a good theory, I'm not sure, wouldn't want to try to apply.
It doesn't contain oil from the rock, but there is
It's-
the hydrocarbon
Right.
bearing, like gunk
Like
sometimes you
grease,
put on the.
grease or something like that?
Yeah, it could be grease, it could be anything in that world.
Yeah, but the water essentially, or the soil is essentially tested high in the very, very beginning, like you saw there for the diesel and organics, but really it's the sodium is just salty, and it got mitigated down. I don't know if that answers the question.
Any other questions from our group?
I guess, so is all of the infrastructure just Gunnison Energy infrastructure, or is it shared with SG?
Most of it is Gunnison, there is spurs that we share.
And so the standard operating procedure that you now developed on this, is that going to be applicable to those spurs with SG? How are you coordinating on that?
I've got meetings with SG. Right now, it's our operation, what we operate, so that's what we're implementing, but we're sharing that right now with SG.
We're gonna work on putting a bridging document together so that we're aligned.
Yeah.
But right now, we're setting, since we're new to this company, we're setting our own policies and procedures, and the next step is to bridge with them.
Yeah, we're working on that now.
Where's Elise? Is Dave Baumgarten still on the line?
Probably, he's on mute, let me unmute him.
While you're doing that, Solar, can we get a copy of the presentation since you
Yeah, let
went
me
through
take
it
some
so
of the numbers
fast?
out though, since some of that was COGCC and some of it, but we will provide it.
That's great.
No problem.
And
David, you're on, we've got a question for you.
My question would be,
All right,
did Gunnison County find that the response was adequate?
The question is, did you find that the response to the spill was adequate? And I think earlier, the question was, how were you guys informed of, and what did that notification process look like? That was a previous question before we started.
so the answer to the first question is yes. The second is we were notified two different ways, one by the company and the second was by the COGCC. And the information that each provided was consistent with the other.
What would he have done different, if anything?
Would you guys have done anything differently on this?
I'm sorry, please?
Would you have done anything differently on this?
No.
No. Anything else? All right. This was really helpful. We as a working group have had the conversation of how does that process work? How do you ensure that there's follow-up and cleanup? So just having an example to look at is very helpful, I think. Natasha?
Since Wendell asked the question of David in terms of what Gunnison County would have done differently, and I know you're a new team, but what would you have done differently?
Well, none of this is an excuse, but obviously we were getting our bearings for the first 3 months. We would have probably had way better mapping, lat and longs, exactly where the pipe is, what the size of the pipe is, how long it was installed. That's something that I've run a lot of operations that would know, and we'd have AutoCAD or some type of a drawing that was detailed. That's something we probably would have done up front and had that set aside. But also probably the pressure testing is probably something that we would do more often as well. There's an element of balance between if you're not operating much, you don't potentially test as much, but that's really not the excuse. We need to test regardless because weather changes, things happen. So probably a different, just standard operating procedure and the data up front. So we were in data gathering phase for 3 months. What did we have? Where are the valves? What's below the ground? We didn't know that. So that was the part that we should have had up front. But that's what we would have done differently, not only in the installation, but also on the standard, quarterly testing or whatever else.
I'm glad you brought up the mapping piece, because that's something we bring up consistently, is that the mapping on this is inadequate.
I think Elise or maybe Robbie, and I think maybe David at some point, I'm not sure if they've really seen all the pipeline maps before, and that's why we're trying to just show what we've got out there. I think we pretty much know everything now and where every valve is and all of that, but that's something that obviously we're going to be giving to the county, which I don't think before they had.
And to be clear, that mapping's on all pipelines, not just on produced water lines?
The gas and water line, where the water is always where the gas is in some way, shape, or form, but the gas, there's about 20 additional miles of gas lines, and that'll be mapped as well, which is mainly the stuff to the north that he showed.
Great. Any other questions? Okay. So we can go back to our table if you want, or we can continue to sit here, it doesn't matter, but our last few minutes were really to take community input, and Sandra's the only one here, so, but I think this is just an opportunity to talk about more broadly. Sandra, if you've got anything else to add, or if you've got another question or two, and then I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about our next meeting to make sure we're all on the same page. Do we want to go sit back down at the table? Or do you want to do it from here? Everyone looks comfy, so, all right. So, Lysandra, do you have any other comments or questions?
Yeah, thank you very much for offering public comment and also for the presentations, very illuminating. I was intrigued by Mr. Baumgartner's comments. Not once, but twice, he pointed out that that the regulations should help the applicant move forward, and I agree with that. If you want, to an extent, I mean, we're talking about this in our land use regs. If we want business to come, we need to make it simple and straightforward and clear. However, hearing that twice from him, I didn't hear it in that comment also the concerns of the constituency, the taxpayers. It makes me doubtful, and I don't know Gunnison County at all, but it makes me a little concerned that there's a bit too much industry interest and industry clout there.
Can I ask David to respond to that? Since
Sure.
he's here? Hey, David, so the question is, or maybe the comment, but that when you were talking about Gunnison County's approach, that you talked a lot about making sure to help the applicant through the process, and that we didn't hear anything about what it looks like for the taxpayer, for the concerned constituent. Do you want to talk a little bit about how your process incorporates the community into it, or how it does, if it does?
Sure. I think people who are present in your room might better state what their experience has been. We provide abundant notice, opportunity to comment, and we consider those comments extraordinarily well.
Talk about your.
And I think probably it's better to hear from the people who have made the comment about what their experience has been.
I'm guessing he's referring to me and to CHC, and I have to say that Gunnison County's approach to public comment has been exceptional, and they take them very seriously, follow up with them to ask if any clarification on them, and I think they, at least from my perspective, it appears treats all sides equally. And I can't speak for your side, and I'm guessing you're in touch with them more than we are, but at least from our perspective, the public comment period has been transparent, open, and always seeking clarification. And I hope he was able to hear that.
Natasha said she likes it. that you guys have been
Now,
good.
that would be a useful one for me to actually hear.
So Natasha said that you guys really take the comments seriously, seek clarification, and really appear to treat all sides equally. Does that get it?
Nope, can't hear you.
Oh, you didn't hear that?
Not at all.
All right. Natasha said that you guys definitely listen to the comments, take them seriously, seek clarification, and treat all sides equally.
Well, I'll be darned. That's what we want.
I think our process has room for improvement on how we seek comment, for sure. I think that's, and so far we've only, our specific development process itself has room for improvement, and that's what we're following, and I definitely think that's an area for our group to think through is how do we improve that interface.
I will say something else that I really valued with Gunnison County is that the onus wasn't always on us to have to follow up, but they took the initiative to follow up on our comments and say, did we understand this correctly?
Point well taken.
Who's she representing?
All right.
You had another question?
I don't have another question. On that same topic, at least, in the master plan process, when the planning commission adopted the master plan to present and move forward with this, there was some conflict over the silent majority. that we're not really showing up. So that's a discussion I think is worth having a little bit more of. And then as the last quick points I'll make is, as far as produced water, I understand that the list of chemicals are often proprietary, but I think it would be worth, I don't know if other counties have ever done this might be a question for David, is can the operator and the county have a non-disclosure agreement that allows the county to know what the chemicals are that are being used in the event of these issues, and it, you know, it's not open to the public. I think that would be really great, and maybe other counties do have that apparatus.
Hey, David, another question maybe for you. Do you know of other counties, or does Gunnison County require disclosure of chemicals that are within like produced water? Or even through like some kind of non-disclosure agreement so that it's not necessarily public, but you know what it is in the event there's an issue?
We do not currently have a non-disclosure agreement. I think the state may, but we do not.
I'd love to see that discussed. And I love the visual drone inspections are great, but it would be, if the pipeline can't be inspected in an area, you gotta find a way to inspect it, or I don't think you should have pipeline there. Because, I mean, let's face it, mechanical malfunctions are gonna happen. I love these triple, prevention measures of the cathoids and all of that. Did I have that right? Anyway, that's great, but you know, 2,000 years from now, this stuff is gonna corrode if it doesn't corrode before then. So the software imagery analysis would be great. I would love to make that recommendation as perhaps a county suggestion or a county reg, and have operators even volunteer that. And then my only last concern is the soil that went to the Adobe Buttes landfill. I'm glad no water sources were impacted, but I suppose you paid fines for that to deposit it there. But that is still hazardous waste that we are dealing with. And that's actually, you know, most of these wells are in Gunnison County, but we're getting the externalities of it because Delta County's roads are the ones that access them. Am I right? Yeah.
This is a special way, I should let Carl comment on this, but I think these companies that take it handle it very carefully and combust it, or they get rid of it in a special way. Carl, can you talk about what the contractor does with that soil?
Like in terms of the,
Yeah.
I think what they basically do is a chemical composition of it and then store it, both the baseline and then the subsequent samples we use for the whole thing.
So I think we're talking about the actual disposal of the soil once you cleaned it up and you removed it. Where did it go, and what does that process look like?
If that was for me, I apologize, I didn't get it.
This was working so well earlier. All right. We were talking about the actual soil once it was removed. Where did it get disposed of, and how does that disposal process work? The concern is it just going to the landfill and creating a new problem at the landfill?
Solar, I can hear you okay. Do you mind repeating that for me?
Yeah. Can you hear me? Can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Okay. Whenever they did the cleanup on the dirty soil and they hauled it away to a facility, do you know what they did at that facility?
I don't know what to say. I got full bars here.
Just these special companies, it's a special company that takes
I'm really sorry.
toxic or I guess the dirty
Let's follow up
soil.
on that, because I don't know the answer. I kind of want to know myself
But-
exactly what they do on that, so.
But-
I don't want to misstate and say
No.
something they're
But it
specifically
is
doing, but it's a special company that
can
manages.
handle it and has handled such
Yeah.
items in the past,
It-
so.
yeah.
I know, we had done a in situ kind of project at my previous company, and it was, basically like a soil farming, and they put in microbes that ate away the items that we didn't want in the soil to make it clean filter.
It doesn't go out somewhere else, it's managed there, and it's costly.
So is it a hazmat company, pretty much?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they're licensed with CDPHE to handle that kind of waste.
It's a very specific service they provide. So,
Mike, I saw your hand go up.
Well, in my experience, since the majority of that is saltwater contaminated soil is taken to the dump and dumped. It's, you know, when you talk about the diesel in the water, I had an issue in years past in this county where I hauled water to a tank to run a frac job, and it was fresh water. We took it from the gravel company, we drove it up to an above ground tank, and we never used it. And when I did water samples on it, it had diesel contamination in it. And the reason it had diesel contamination in it is because you have no control over what these water haulers are hauling. They might haul diesel one day, cow manure the next day, whatever. And so here I had a perfectly good water sample that was contaminated by the truck that drove it. So instead of having something I could dispose of with no issue, I had to take it, and that was all liquid, I had to take it to a disposal well after I evaporated it down and hauled it off. But when it's just soil contaminated with salt, that's, you know, your TDS is probably around 4,200.
Most of it's chlorides.
Yeah, and it's all chlorides for the most part, and some bicarbs as well. And that's the bane of the Mancos shale around here. My irrigation water has a 2,200 TDS, and that's what I grow grass with, you know, so, and there's places that are worse. You take water out of the reservoir in Crawford, and it's got a 30% higher TDS in September than the water that comes out of the mountains in June. So, but, you know, you're putting salty dirt in a place that is known for salty dirt, which is the landfill. Now, if you got, I heard the word toxic, you don't get to put toxic there. You get to put salt contaminated soils in there.
Thank you.
That's why Joby Beach is where it's at.
Anything else? We're right at 7:30 now.